and he can explain exactly what his title is. But Roy, if you'd come up, you can be first, and then I just saw that. Oh. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Roy Bowen. I'm the president of the Georgia Association of Manufacturers and also serve as the chairman of the Advisory Council to the State Board of Workers' Compensation, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to be with this committee today. At the chairman's request, I'd like to cover 4 areas, and fairly briefly. One, just a bit of an overview about the Georgia comp system. 2, get into the genesis, the role, the composition, and the work of the council. Talk a little bit about the veto of House Bill 795, and conclude with an advance look, if you will, at what the Advisory Council has recommended to the chairman, which will be brought to the General Assembly in terms of a legislative package for 2019. The Georgia work comp system is big business. There's over 4 million Georgians that are covered by the Act. Looking back to 2016, just to give you an idea in terms of the dollar magnitude, benefits paid in terms of claims, medical claims and indemnity, were $1.375 billion. Of that, about 52% was for medical and about 47% for indemnity. So about $654 million medical and $724 million for indemnity. Fully insured, or we call it the private market, covers about 73.5% of those 4 million plus employees or workers. Self-insureds cover about 26.5%. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the universe within which we work. Georgia's, I think it's also important for you to understand that the workers' comp system is funded entirely by assessments on employers and insurers. There's not any state money used to pay salaries, rent, operating costs. It's all paid for by employers and insurers. And if an insurer is paying it, the employer is paying a part of that through premium. I think that's something that a lot of folks don't really realize. I'll also say that Georgia's workers' comp system is really very highly rated by the agencies that look at comp systems across the country. It's very high marks for the efficient way in which it's administered and for its costs. And for the way that it serves the interest of the injured worker, believes to be reasonable for the employers whose premiums directly fund the system, and also fair to the providers and insurers and other stakeholders. And I will conclude this portion by saying that economic development has really helped to propel this state 6 years in a row, very best state in which to do business. I will tell you that the workers' comp system is something that every company that is seeking to locate in Georgia or expand in Georgia looks at. And I think that we can be proud of a workers' comp system in Georgia that is perceived as fair to all involved and is effectively administered. I'll talk a little bit about the genesis of the Advisory Council. It goes back really more than 20 years. There was rarely a piece of legislation that was more divisive or that involved more rough and tumble lobbying than workers' comp legislation. It would make the arguments or debates that you have today on some very contentious issues look mild in comparison. I'll tell you that elections were won or lost on the basis of votes that were cast in the chambers on workers' comp legislation. There was very little dialogue, if any, among the stakeholders. We sort of staked out our position, and everybody piled on over at the General Assembly. Everybody tried to sort of muscle their positions through the process. And the effect was really a pretty dysfunctional system that neither served the injured worker well or was fair to the employers in the state. And it was costly in many ways. It was costly to members of the General Assembly who had served well and didn't return because of positions they took in the area of workers' comp. There were really no political winners. It was costly in terms of workers' comp costs. Insurers were leaving the state. The notion that there had to be a better way to address the workers' comp issue and concerns of all the system stakeholders was embraced by then Senator Hal Dawkins, who was ultimately appointed chairman of the State Board of Workers' Compensation by Governor Miller. While there had been an advisory council in place, I wouldn't say it functioned as effectively as it does today. Hal Dawkins changed things. His vision was to create an advisory council composed of representatives of all the stakeholder groups, the workers, organized labor, businesses of all size, small, medium, and large, insured companies, self-insured companies, workers' comp insurance carriers, TPAs, medical providers, including rehab folks, claimant attorneys, and defense attorneys. And these stakeholder representatives were expected to bring their perspective, the perspective of their profession or calling, to the council, more than to have the council act as a platform for them to serve as an advocate for. We wanted their perspective. And that's really the way things have been operating since that time. You were expected to work in a very collaborative fashion with other stakeholder representatives, and then collectively work to enhance the workers' comp system in a way that it would better serve the injured worker, provide employers with a sense that the system was fair, and ensure that the providers were being treated fairly. You had to check your personal agendas at the door, but we wanted you to bring your perspective. And I believe that that vision is being realized today. The Georgia Workers' Comp System and the Advisory Council model are highly regarded by the stakeholders and really nationally recognized around the country for being an effective way to deal with workers' comp. There's many states that have tried to emulate what we do here in Georgia via the workers' comp system. We'll talk a little bit about the organization of the Advisory Council. It consists of about 110 members. This is the roster of members. There's some turnover every year to ensure that we have some fresh ideas on the council. There are 6 committees. Every stakeholder group is represented on one of these six committees. There's generally between 15 and 20 members of a committee. Those committees include the Legislative Committee. That committee really takes in input from members of the Legislative Committee about legislative changes that folks would like to see. They distill those, and they make a recommendation to the chairman. The Rules and Mediation Committee drafts rules that implement legislation that's been passed and addresses rules or issues that are non-statutorily in nature. The rules, by the way, do go. Any rule that's promulgated by the Rules Committee, adopted by the board, do come to the committees of jurisdiction, to this committee, and on the Senate side, to the Senate Insurance and Labor Committee. Both these committees work towards consensus. In fact, the council in its entirety works toward consensus and coming to agreement on issues brought before it. There's a Public Education Committee. They conduct seminars around the state, really well-attended seminars by all stakeholder groups all around the state, and then they hold a conference annually, again, to share information. So it's their role to put into the public domain some of the actions and developments that take place at the board. There's a medical committee They deal with fee schedules and medical-related issues. One of the things that you'll be hearing about this year is the work that they've done on opioids. There's a licensure and self-insurance committee. They're involved in the insurance aspects of workers' comp to safeguard the financial integrity of the system. And finally, there's a rehabilitation and managed care committee, and they're involved with this very employee-centric issue to ensure quality of care. I will tell you that without getting into the weeds, these committees work very, very diligently within the area of their responsibility. They meet very frequently, some of them once a month. There are subcommittees of these committees that meet on a regular basis. The full council meets annually, and all the committees report to each other, or to the council, the work that they've been undertaking. I want to tell you that even though we have 6 committees, they don't operate in silos. There's a lot of collaboration between committees. Could be the medical committee and the legislative committee, public affairs committee, the public education committee, and licensure and self-insurance committee. So there's lots of interaction between these committees. It's a very transparent process. There's a lot of sharing of information. We welcome folks to attend these committee meetings. In fact, Chairman Werkheiser has attended council meeting. I think others on the committee have attended some of these meetings. I'll tell you, I have been really impressed by the knowledge base of the folks that serve on this council. We really could not afford as a state to buy the kind of expertise that's so freely given by members of this committee, these 110 members that represent every stakeholder group. They take pride in their work. They work collaboratively. And there's, I think one of the things that delights me is that there really is a degree of collegiality amongst these various stakeholder groups. At the end of the day, that leads to the kind of system that we have today, one that we can all be proud of, and that's a model across the country. I want to turn now to the veto that Chairman Werkheiser mentioned. And I'd like to, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, read the veto message, because I think it gets to the heart of the value of the Advisory Council. The governor said House Bill 795 would subject the State Board of Workers' Compensation to many of the requirements of the Georgia Administrative Procedures Act, from which it is explicitly exempted by current law. The board's current rulemaking and proposed legislation process relies on a consensus of stakeholders through its advisory council. This bill would permit, and to some extent encourage, the House and Senate Judiciary Committees, the House Industry and Labor Committee, and the Senate Insurance and Labor Committee to override such consensus, effectively giving the legislature significant control over workers' compensation policy. While I do not doubt the sincere intention of the author of this amendment to House Bill 795, this shift seems to undermine the policy objectives behind the creation of the state's workers' compensation system and circumvent the largely successful advisory council process. Rather than significantly altering this process through a late amendment to an otherwise innocuous bill, I encourage the legislature to focus on providing input to the Board of Workers' Compensation through current law and board rules. Similarly, it is imperative that the Board of Workers' Compensation continue to provide notice of proposed rules to relevant legislative committees pursuant to board rules, and to encourage appropriate comment and legislative interaction. For the foregoing reasons, I veto House Bill 795. My organization and the council and other organizations, mostly business organizations from around the state, wrote to the governor asking that he veto the bill. And in fact, among those encouraging a veto was at least one prominent member of the claimants bar. You know, we asked for the veto for a number of reasons, but they were really based on process and substantive grounds. In terms of process, we viewed this this last-minute amendment as really bypassing the advisory council process that had really worked so well, and we thought it was unhealthy. And then, contrary to from a substantive standpoint, contrary to the recommendation of the Governor's Court Reform Council, which expressly recommended that workers' comp not be put under the APA. And there are those who also believe that it conflicted with the current law, which specifically exempted the state board. To some extent, I will admit that we incurred a self-inflicted wound. I don't think, we sort of took for granted that the General Assembly understood the value and work of the Advisory Council. What didn't dawn on us was that, there has been a great amount of turnover in the General Assembly since the early days, since the days when they had these pitched battles. There's nobody on this committee, I don't believe, that was around back in the day. So we have not done a good job in conveying to this committee, the Senate Counterpart Committee, and to your colleagues in the House and Senate what we do, how we do it, how we're organized, the process we go through, and its value to this General Assembly. We also don't want to ever lose sight of the fact that you're the ones that press the red and green buttons, and you also have the authority to introduce legislation. We just want to be there as a resource, and we also want you to know that when we do bring legislation, it has really been thoroughly vetted by everybody that's got a hand in the workers' comp system. I'd like to just share with you, give a little preview, if you will, on what we're going to be recommending, or what the chairman is going to be recommending for 2019. I'll tell you a little bit about the process. It's all gone through the legislative committee. As a recommendation to the chairman, we are the chairman's advisory council. We've had chairmen that have generally accepted the recommendations of the council, but we are an advisory council. The chairman will take the recommendations of the legislative committee, and he needs to take those to the governor. And there's forms on which you make your case and so forth. So it goes from the advisory council to the chairman, from the chairman to the governor's office. Then the governor signs off on the proposed agency legislation. We're in the process now of seeking approval for the package for 2019. So what I'm going to tell you, I can't tell you whether the incoming governor will agree or not. But we're recommending a $100 increase in the maximum weekly benefit, the largest increase that's ever been recommended to a benefit increase. And we've done that because, there hasn't been an increase since 2016 for a variety of reasons, and we can get into that. But we also have as a goal to have the maximum weekly benefit approximate 2/3 of the state's average weekly wage. Average weekly wage is about $1,003, and we look at that all the time. So we do try to keep it at about 2/3. I will tell you that currently about 30% of the claimants do hit the max, only about 30%. And if the General Assembly approves this recommendation, about 20% would achieve the max. And these are only for injuries that occur on or after the effective date of the bill, which would be July 1. With the increase in the full benefit, there's also a corresponding increase but smaller in the temporary partial benefit and in the death benefit. We're going to do another thing, and this, I will tell you, was asked for by the employers. Another recommendation that was embraced by the employers, in fact, I'm not so sure we didn't service it, was to make an exception to the 400-week cap on medical benefits in non-catastrophic cases. Our view was that particularly if you've got a joint replacement, the 400-week cap may put you beyond the time, or you'd be beyond the time if you have a problem with that joint replacement. And we thought it was only fair in very limited circumstances to break that 400-week cap. Another thing you're going to hear about, and there's been a lot of work done on this. There still may be, I'm not sure if there's any controversy remaining, but a lot of work. Opioids is an issue in this state and across the country. Overprescribing. What I believe we're going to recommend is some prescription guidelines on prescribing opioids in workers' comp cases, and these are going to be consistent with accepted medical protocols. It's a massive problem. I will tell you that this is only going to apply to injuries, again, that occur on or after July 1. Because, we've got this whole group of legacy folks that are on opioids. And we frankly don't know how to deal with them, but to subject them to new prescription guidelines is not the right thing to do, we don't think. But this is an example of an issue that's being addressed by the Medical Committee, Legislative Committee, Rules Committee, and Public Education Committee. So what we are going to try to do is have a piece of legislation, and at the same time, and this came as really, I think, an excellent suggestion from the claimants bar, is to have a set of rules. So we know in advance when the legislation is passed, we also know what the rules are going to be. It's not that you're going to pass legislation and then work on rules down the road. So everybody has input into the legislation and the rules. And then, of course, the rules have to come to this committee and to your Senate counterpart committee. I will tell you that this is not a cost-saving measure for employers. This is a life-saving measure, and we hope that it has your support. The final component of the legislation, of the bill, the package, was really a piece that was passed last year but got caught up in the veto. And that deals with this director emeritus status that was put into place years ago before there was a good pension program for directors. It could be that you retire and then you could become an emeritus and get a fairly good percentage of your salary to continue on. Well, this wasn't ever addressed once the pension program was put in place. So somebody could retire after 20 years of service, get their benefit, their pension benefit, and a good percentage of their salary. In effect, making more being retired than they were working. Doesn't smell right. Now, there is a cost savings here. I mentioned early on that employers pay for the system. This bill doesn't affect anybody that's currently employed. It's on a prospective basis only. But by the time that everybody works out of, that's currently entitled, works out of this benefit, it will be costing employers upwards of $500,000, $500,000 a year. That's money that could be used for better purposes. So again, we're pleased to have this opportunity to acquaint you with the work of the Advisory Council. As I say, we're here today because I think we've neglected to keep you up to speed on what we do. We're transparent. We hope that you'll continue to call on us, regard us as a resource. And I thank you very much for this opportunity. Be happy to respond to questions now or following everybody else's presentation.
Okay. Vice Chair Kirby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Roy. And there's I guess several things that from what you said. Number one, I would contend never was the intent of this to affect the Advisory Council. And by saying that, could you speculate maybe what we were trying to address?
To tell you what, we don't know.
What we're trying to address. We think the board rulemaking has exceeded what we think they should be doing.
Well,
period, straight up.
Yeah.
And it's not the advisory. If it's the rulemaking committee, then maybe it inadvertently was one we should be addressing. We love the way the advisory committee's worked over the years. It's done a great job, and you and I know, from my real job, as they say, I deal with it all the time, and it does a great job. But the rulemaking has gotten a little out of control, and by Board Rule 60, I've been on this committee since 2012. I've never gotten the first rule from the state board that they're going to implement. Not one to look at. Nothing.
I will tell you that we can document that every rule has been sent to the committee chair. Number two, we've got the chairman of the Rules Committee here that would be pleased to respond to your concerns about the Rules Committee. I view the Legislative Committee, Rules, not much differently than the General Assembly. There are hundreds of bills that are introduced here every one of them with a good intention. The author believes in every one of them. You have that same dynamic on the Advisory Council and the committees. Everybody thinks their proposed rule or their proposed legislation is the best, but it's a process that you work your way through. And at the end of the day, when a rule is promulgated, it is accepted. It is accepted by the majority of those on that committee. Does it please everybody all the time? No. But at the end of the day, I will say that this system has benefited by that process, and I can't think of any rules that are out there right now that if there's a problem with the rule, I will tell you this too, Representative Kirby, somebody can raise, and it happens all the time, not all the time, but it happens occasionally. You can raise a concern with the rule and it will be revisited.
Well, like I said, appreciate your time. And another thing on this 2019 legislation, from an employer standpoint, it looks a little one-sided, and isn't it about time we start talking subrogation, especially on medical benefits?
Well, I'll tell you, it gets to, some people would say the Rules Committee's out of whack. Some people might say the Legislative Committee's out of whack because that hasn't been taken up, but it's been discussed, and it may take some time. I will tell you this too. You take a look at this piece of legislation. Mm-hmm. Some of this stuff needs to be done. The employers, we're not necessarily looking for an eye for an eye. Some of this needs to be done. But I will tell you, some of the concerns of employers are also addressed by way of the Rules Committee, rules that are sent to this committee to take a look at. And I know that Mr. Gannon can comment on a couple of, really great success stories of issues that have been resolved to the benefit of both the injured worker and the employer through the Rules Committee. One involves this access to medical treatment.
Thank you.
Okay. Any others? Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Any volunteers from the speakers list to go next?
I'll go next.
Okay.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Mark Gannon. I'm a defense lawyer. I do workers' compensation. When I started practicing in 1976, the compensation rate was $95 a week. So I'm hearing that it's about to go up to $675. I've also had the pleasure of serving on the advisory council since 1994, and I've chaired the Rules Committee since 2000. So I figure that I better come up here and answer any questions you all have. I will tell you that we conduct business very transparently. We meet on a monthly basis at the board. Our meetings are open to all. We take suggestions from all quarters. We publish minutes after our meeting. Those minutes are disseminated to all of the other chairs of the advisory council, to Chairman Bowen, to the chairman of the board, to the directors, the executive director, and the chief ALJ. And at the end of our session, which is May, we make our final recommendations. They go to the chairman, and the chairman then writes to the chairman of this committee and the Senate counterpart, submitting all of the recommended rule changes. That's how we conduct our business. We have representatives from all of the stakeholders, and we have open, lively discussions about all the issues. And I would say that our primary goal is to avoid unintended consequences. And I would say that 75% of what comes to us, we don't do anything with. The other 25% is the product of much discussion, much debate, much deliberation, and ultimately consensus. So one of the successes that Roy mentioned is in 2017, to address the issue of delay in medical treatment, we developed a new board form called the WCPMT. It requires a telephone conference within 5 days of the filing of this document in order for the insurance company or the employer to either authorize or not authorize a recommended treatment by an authorized treating physician. As of the end of September, 1,724 of these forms have been filed. 1,407 were completed without a telephone conference. 862 resulted in authorizations. 361 were resulted in controversies. 16, the cases settled before the telephone conference, and 120 were withdrawn or canceled by the petitioner. We had no idea that this document would result in such a vast number of petitions, nor did we realize the success it would have in delivering medical treatment to an injured worker. As Roy said, sometimes there are unintended consequences. If there's a rule that is interpreted in a way that wasn't intended, we revisit it. So in our last meeting, which was last Friday, we looked at a rule concerning the panel of physicians that allowed for the substitution of a physician on a panel under limited circumstances, and it was interpreted as having an effect beyond that, and so we have recommended an amendment to the rule to limit it to the purpose for which it was intended. Nothing is said in concrete. We don't do legislation. We try to effectuate rules that allow the law to operate as we think it was intended. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Any questions? Okay. Mr. Herndon, you want to go next?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Thomas Herman. I am a claimants lawyer from Macon, Georgia. I'm actually president of the Workers' Compensation Claimants Lawyers Organization, which represents lawyers who represent injured workers here in the state. I'm a long-time member of the Advisory Council, serving on the medical committee for a number of years, and I'm a strong supporter of the advisory process. I feel like I echo Mr. Bowen's comments that by bringing all of the stakeholders together, working for the good of the system, that ultimately the product that we come up with works for the good of the system as a whole, and that's the goal. That process broke down under the former chairman, frankly. We got away from the collaborative process, the consensus process. Things were being done by executive fiat rather than considering the disparate interests that are brought to the table at this process. I commend the current chairman for seeking to get back to that process. I think it's still a work in process. I don't think we're back to where we should be, but I think we are doing a good job. And certainly on behalf of myself and the claimants' lawyers, we are working to make sure that happens. But obviously, this board does have the authority to oversee what the Workers' Comp Board does, and if we're not doing our job, then it's obviously within the legislature's purview to exercise its authority. But I'm a supporter of the advisory process.
Any questions? All right, I'm going to ask Judge Chastain to come up. We were very excited to have him, Judge Chastain, because, yeah, we've known him for years in the Speaker's office, and to that end, he brings the unique perspective of knowing the legislative process probably on a deeper level than most of us will ever know, and but he also understands the workers' comp process. So Judge, share your comments.
Thank you very much. First, I want to introduce Judge Viola Drew of the State Board. She is a former director, position that I hold. And she's now Deputy Executive Director. And we have Chief Trial Judge David Imahara with us as well. And they have vast experience and, more importantly, are backing me up on any technical questions y'all may have, being at the board 4 months now. But I think I heard Chairman Kirby, his question loud and clear. I can tell you, like, my 4 months at the board, I've been so impressed with the dedication and the commitment to both the injured workers and the employers to try to administer the system and administer justice. The advisory council, to me, I think Roy Bowen said that they have discussions. I've seen some heated arguments in there, and I think that's healthy because they work for the chairman and the board to try to hash out these policies and try to reach consensus, so we're not dumping it in the lap of the legislature. That said, it's probably the best process we can come up with, but it's not perfect. You know, in my time in the Speaker's office, which was certainly a highlight of my career, we certainly wanted agencies to be responsive to us and the committees of jurisdiction, and we are a creature of statute. And we have no more authority than the General Assembly and the Governor of Georgia give us. And I want the input on what we're doing right, what we can do better. I think that makes us all, you know, that just helps the whole system. And if there's any way that we can communicate better or maybe get information to y'all sooner, certainly happy to do that. And I want to commend specifically the plaintiffs' bar and the employers, because I do think they have strong disagreements, but I do think they all have the best interest of the system in mind. And it's only going to work as good as the people managing it and trying to make decisions based on these policies and policy differences. So, you know, we have to be vigilant on the board that we continue to be fair and open and subject to input and direction at times from the legislature. And with that, I'll pause for any questions that y'all may have.
You have one, Mr. Kirby?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And not really a question. I just want to make sure clear. Now, as an HR professional in the last 20 years, I've had to deal with workers' comp in probably 15 states, if my count's right. I wouldn't trade Georgia for any of them. The advisory board and Roy and I, we've had this conversation a lot. What they've done has been just awesome. We've got, I think, by far the best, most fair, balanced comp system of any of the states I have to deal with for both the employer and employee. You know, but I think, and I think maybe our last speaker hit the nail on the head. other chairmen maybe not quite as in tune with the collaborative workings that this should be, and maybe a little bit more executive fiat was going on, and I think that's a whole lot of the reason for this amendment. And like I said, the intent was never to address or change the advisory committee, but the rulemaking fiating was put on notice, put it that way.
Understood. If I may circle back to one issue that we've talked a little bit about, and that's the opioid potential rule or potential prescribing guidelines on opioids. The medical committee, the doctors have recommended to the board that we address in some instances what may be overprescribing and prescribing to injured worker that has a job, been injured on the job, seeks medical attention, and gets hooked on opiates, and it affects their quality of life. It can affect their families, and we see cases like this all the time. And the question really is should the board do something about it, and what does that look like, and who all can we bring along? This is a major issue, and no decision has been taken on whether or not to move forward with a bill or a rule or anything like that. I think that's a major policy change. We would need to be sure of buy-in from the governor, from the speaker, lieutenant governor, these committees of jurisdiction. It's just not something that's done in the dead of night with no input. By way of example, we've been struggling with it for 2 years. I've been at the board 4 months and just got the history of going back of us struggling with trying to help people dealing with this, and that's not to say that there's not legitimate circumstances where people have been injured and have or have structural damage that need ongoing opiates. I mean, that's clearly the case, and there's no doubt about it. But it's some of these. It's the intent to try to protect the workers to the best of our ability from getting unnecessarily addicted to opioids. That's our goal. What it looks like, I have no idea.
Okay. Thank you, Judge. Mr. Ralph Perales.
Chairman, may I hand out this summary?
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak today. I usually don't like to read, but I've been told that I need to stay on message because I don't want to subject it to my passion when I talk about this sort of thing. But I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Pull that mic toward you a little bit. Okay.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Ralph Perales. I'm a workers' compensation lawyer who represents injured workers. Been practicing for 31 years. About the last 18 years, I've been doing almost exclusively workers' comp, about 99% of the work that I do. I am also the current president of GWA, which is the Georgia Injured Worker Advocates. It's a professional association of lawyers who represent injured workers throughout the state of Georgia and who devote the vast majority of their practice to representing injured workers. Our goals and objectives as an organization are to advocate for workers' compensation system that treats injured workers, employers, and the medical community in a fair and balanced manner. And that's just not something that I thought of today. If you go to our website, you will see that on our front page as our goals. For too long, the advisory council created by the chair of the State Board of Workers' Compensation has operated without supervision from you, really. It bears to note that the legislature actually, back in 1992, I believe, enacted legislation to create an advisory council. And it never happened. Nothing happened. Instead, the board created its own advisory council, not following your directive. And that legislation, I believe, was revoked back in 2005 after everybody realized, well, you know, nobody's done anything with that. So what we have now is this advisory council created by the chair of the State Board of Workers' Compensation that operates without supervision. And in fact, it has been legislating via rule enactment. So I commend you for demonstrating an interest in looking closer at the state of our workers' compensation system. The Advisory Council plays an important role in vetting legislation that you, as the legislator, must enact. But the process at the Advisory Council is far from fair or balanced. Now, of course, those who control that process want you to believe that it's working perfectly. But the reality is far from that. Now, let me parenthetically say that I have the utmost respect from some of those members in the council. In fact, Roy Bowen and I worked together on some legislation back in, I think, 2006, 2005 timeframe, and I was very impressed with him. I have the utmost respect for Roy. So nothing that I'm saying is meant to cast aspersion against those who perhaps are seeking to control the advisory council. They're just doing what they think is best for their constituents. It's something that I probably would seek to do myself in their shoes. So, but let me make it very clear, I'm not trying to say that these people are not acting honorably. But let's start with the composition of advisory council. You have before you a chart that what we did was we took down and broke down the members on the advisory council based on the most recent roll that I have, which shows about 98 members. It came out about maybe 30 days or 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago. And actually, we started this process a little earlier than that based on last year's roll when it had 110 members, as Mr. Bowen stated. And we broke them down by stakeholders. If you represent the employer-insurer stakeholders, we put them under one category. If you represent the injured worker, another category. If you represent the medical community, we put them in another category. And then we have two other categories. Basically, one is for state board employees that are members of the council. And the other last one is an other category that we don't know. The vast majority of those, I believe like 7 or 8 out of 9 of those folks are in the rehab industry, and they're mostly work in the rehab committee. That's their expertise. If we did not know how to categorize somebody, I put them in the other category. But if we look at the composition, advisory council is comprised of members that are not elected. They're handpicked and appointed by the chair of the state board. It operates under no bylaws or rules that I know of. It does not publish its meeting agenda or the minutes from its meetings for the public to see. There are no guidelines as to voting requirements by its membership in order to advance legislation or rules. They just talk about consensus. We don't know what that means, because I can tell you that the claimant's bar has not consented to a lot of this thing that has been passed the last few years, going back to the 400-week cap on medical benefits and beyond. And so advisory responds to no one other than the chair who appoints its members. And if you don't go along, or if you object to the agenda that is set for advisory to pursue by those who control the process, if you question the need for a proposed change too strenuously, yes, you can object, you can debate, but if you really oppose and get in the way of what they want to do, you find yourself receiving a nice letter that says, "Thank you for your service. We've decided to make sure we rotate other people in and out of the committee." The advisory council is advertised as having representation from stakeholders in our worker compensation system, and that is true. But its membership composition is in no way balanced. Now, it is interesting to note that the system we call the workers' compensation system, the agency is called the State Board of Workers' Compensation. And yet only 14% of the members of advisory represent the interest of an injured worker. 58% of the members represent the interest of employers and insurance companies. 10% of the membership represents the medical community, a very important stakeholder in a system that is supposed to deliver a prompt and adequate medical care. 5 out of the 6 committees that you heard about are chaired by a representative of the employer or the insurance company. In fact, I believe for the second or maybe the third year, the medical committee is chaired by a member of the insurance industry, not by a medical doctor as in years past. Now, let me be very clear, because I don't want anybody out there spreading rumors. I am not here advocating in any way for the demise of the advisory council. I'm not trying to destroy it. In fact, quite the opposite. I want to make it better. I am hoping that we can reform it so that it will live up to its full potential, serve its purpose as intended, and one that will be fair and balanced, one which we can all be proud of and put our trust and confidence in this process. Now, some areas that I'd like to address very briefly, because I know we don't want to get into the weeds yet, but you've heard about the formularies, which is driven by opioids. To my knowledge, there is no case study in Georgia that tells us whether we have a problem with opioids in the workers' compensation system. Yes, we have a problem in the general population, but workers' compensation is a very controlled and closed system. What is the first thing that we do to an injured worker before we stitch him up or take him to the doctor? Drug test him. That's exactly right. From the very get-go, we're drug testing that person. Then we send them to treat with whom? Doctors selected by the insurance companies to treat him. And those doctors don't have a practice in some strip center right off a highway, I-75, those pill mills, general practices that they're creating the problem. These are respected doctors. They have very respected practices. They have the education, training, and experience to know if a patient ought to get opioids or something else. This idea of formularies is a 20th century solution to a 21st century problem. Formularies are obsolete. They're anachronistic. Why? Because medicine is moving 180 degrees away from formularies into personalized medicine, or precision medicine as we call it. Now you've heard about the gene testing that you can do through places like Ancestry.com and all that. Genotype testing has become inexpensive and has become commercially available. I know of some doctors now that are beginning to use it in their practices. What they do is they take a sample, a swab, they send it, and they get back a profile on the genotype testing specific to the treatment that they're seeking. This is not an invasion of privacy as to the whole gene composition of a patient. Unfortunately, I'm beginning to see also some insurance companies that are mailing the kits to the doctors and asking them to take the swab and mail it back to the insurance company when God knows what kind of panels they're running to find out whether you're susceptible to heart attack or cancer or whatever they may be looking for. But some doctors now, particularly in the pain management, are doing this genotype testing because of the advances in the pharmacology, in the pharmacogenetics. You see, every drug has a pharmacokinetic and a pharmacodynamic characteristic. And what that means in its simplest term is that a drug changes your body, that's how it works, or your body changes the drug. And that is why some of you may respond very well to ibuprofen, and somebody else maybe it's Tylenol. It just depends on your genotype testing. So doctors are beginning to use that because they can find out exactly what kind of receptors you have. And they can decide, I know what medication will work for you, and what dosage would be safe for you. That is moving away from formularies, which are one size fits all. If you like socialized medicine, you love formularies, because that's a state agency telling a doctor what they can and cannot do, or telling a patient what kind of treatment to receive or not receive. Let's find out the extent of the problem, if there is a problem, because as I stated, you drug test, you send them to a doctor, then you have nurse case managers that have been sent into the doctor's office to direct the care. You got adjusters, looking over the shoulder. You got pharmacy benefit management companies, PBMs, which are denying to fill medication. You have insurance companies that are sending doctors letters now saying, doctor, here's our opioid use policy. I want you to get the client to sign that. Doctor, I want you to test the client, or drug test the client. And in some instances, they send them, kids that test for like 31 different types of tests. I've seen one when the client may be taking one medication. So why are they testing for 31? If the doctor, all you need to do is track one. So it's something that we need to look at very closely as to why it is that we want that. And the reason is very simple. It's cost containment. Cost containment. That's all it is by insurance companies. You see, we've done some research in some files where we can get the data. We're finding out that about 16 to 20% of the cost of pharmaceuticals are cost containment features. It's not the cost of the medication. The pharmacy charges something, they get paid less. The PBM will send the full bill to the insurance company. That's how they take the cut. So in the end, the numbers that you see reported by the State Board on the cost of drugs and medication, it's not the cost that the pharmacy is getting. It's got cost containment features involved in it. Other areas, we talked about the maximum TTD. Georgia is the only state in the nation, to my knowledge, pretty sure about this, that doesn't have any type of indexing. Indexing is just where you automatically adjust every year to stay, to keep up with the state average weekly wage. Usually that's what most states peg their indexing to. Okay, Georgia's the only state that doesn't have. As of today, Georgia has the second lowest, number 49, max TTD rate in the United States. Below us is Mississippi. I welcome this increase of $100. It's long overdue. I was very glad to hear Mr. Bowen talk about the goal to try to stay, keep up with the state average weekly wage. That would make us number 45 or 46 in the nation, still with that $100, just so you'll know. Medical treatment, we talked about the delay and denial of medical treatment, this PMT form. Wonderful tool. It doesn't solve the problem, though. All it's done is take care of the lazy adjuster, the one that won't return the phone calls, the one that won't send emails, the one that won't approve that MRI, or whatever the doctor wants. And we got about 17, apparently, cases where that was the case. Only 361 were controverted, meaning that they don't agree with the treatment. So that tells us that in this case, 1,400, they just didn't want to answer the phone. That's all it is, But it's a welcome tool to use to sort of try to get some reaction when you call in and send in emails, and you get nothing. Another problem that we're seeing a lot is that doctors who sign up to treat workers' compensation based on the published reimbursement rates in the board-approved fee schedule have been cheated out of their reimbursement rates by insurance companies through the imposition of silent PPOs, rented networks, also devices that they use, that decrease the reimbursement rate of the doctor by 20%, in some instances more than that. So you got doctors that are getting, from what I talk to doctors, they're getting fed up. Now, in the workers' comp system, you're going to find a lot of orthopedic doctors because most injuries are usually breaks, So there's plenty of doctors. But when you start getting to specialties, neurology, a GI specialist, it's pretty tough to find. Endocrinologist, very hard to find because they don't want to deal with workers' compensation. They don't want to deal with the lower reimbursement rates. They don't want to deal with insurance companies trying to go around that. They don't want to deal with insurance companies imposing these cost containment programs like utilization review, which is not allowed in Georgia, and yet they do it all the time, you know. And so, and that is what's causing a lot of the doctors to say, I don't want to handle workers' comp, you know, anymore. Getting hard. These are just a few examples, and I realize that today is not the day to get into all these issues. Just want to sort of give you an idea of some of the problems that we're facing. I mean, I do want to encourage you to take an active role in your oversight of the workers' compensation system. Let the advisory council perform its worthy function in a fair and balanced way. But as President Reagan used to say, trust but verify. Make sure that that is what's happening. And briefly, as far as the Rule 60 comments, Chairman, Vice Chairman, apparently I've heard some maybe dispute or different opinions whether the board had in fact been advising in years past of these rule changes. I asked that question of a prior chair. The answer off the top of his head was no, I don't remember, but it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Take that at face value. But the problem with the enactment of rules is there's just no way to go to appeal that or object to it, especially if they don't notify you of those changes. The rule is imposed, and that's it. I cannot appeal that to the Superior Court or the Court of Appeals. Let me just pause there, and I don't want to take up all the time, but if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to.
We've got a couple, and I'm going to take them in order. Okay. Representative McLean.
Cut me off, did you, Mr. Chairman?
No, you're good.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm, you know, as I read through the document that you passed out, I don't know if Roy, you've seen this, but it really is not a real good document. It doesn't show a good light from what I heard you say. As I'm looking at the breakdown of the committees and things of that nature, I go to one and I look at the on the Rules and Mediation Committee. I'm looking at 60% employees and 27% employees. Then I guess I go to the Public Education Committee, and it just really blows my mind. 80% worth that comprised of 80% employers and 0% of employee. I know. I mean, but I know, but I'm just concerned that I don't know how accurate or true this document is, but it doesn't really do a good light.
At the appropriate time, I again welcome the opportunity to respond. I think this is a bit of a mischaracterization.
Okay, we'll come back.
Yes. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, I hear this, but it is a written document. It's not like you didn't give us a written document. So I do hear you, but I do like to have something in writing, if that's okay with you, Mr. Chairman.
And just to be clear, you see that I was trying to be transparent there by putting the position that the person holds. Now, whether you want to say that defense lawyers don't belong in the employer insurance, I'll accept that. But we do know who they represent, So anyway.
Representative Kirby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to leave this alone, but you brought it up a second time. And I find it personally offensive that you would imply that we drug test people before we get them treatment. I don't do that. I don't know any employers that do that. And I think that's an insult to the employers of the state of Georgia. The problem with workers' comp, what doesn't belong in it is attorneys. We should take care of our people, get them the treatment, and get the attorneys out. And defense attorneys that get between employers and their employees cause more problems every day than anything I got to deal with. And I was going to leave it alone, but you brought it up a second time, and I'm not going to.
And by no means it was to imply that you do that. Unfortunately, there are employers. Well, when I mean employers, I mean as a general category. Look, I can tell you the horror stories if you want to hear. I don't know. I'm not going to get into that now. But I've had employees walk 10 miles with a broken arm so he can go get a drug test. So, so it does happen. Just because you don't see it, I see a lot different employers maybe that you see. So, you know, I'm just going to stand by what I said, but I didn't mean to imply that everybody does it, you know.
Representative Park.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Perales. You had mentioned the 1992 piece of legislation that would have created a board. I was wondering, or a framework similar to this advisory council that was not necessarily followed. I was wondering if you could share any light as to how similar the existing advisory council is to what that board was. Or is it two separate
Unfortunately,
things
all the
completely?
legislature did was say that we will create an advisory council and we will, you know, to advise the board. It was legislatively created, but then there's nothing after that. So apparently it was never put in effect. I believe that it required appointments maybe by, you know, the House, the Senate, you know, sometimes as they do when they create councils, but nothing ever happened. Now, whether the decision was made back then to say, well, we have this advisory council operating now, let's just leave it alone. I mean, I can't speak to that. I wasn't involved in that process back in 1992, so I'm apologize that I can't really
No
give you more
worries.
insight than that.
But the current advisory council is a creation of the Workers' Compensation Board, is that correct?
Yes.
And there is no actual oversight, legislative oversight at this moment, at least in terms of the rulemaking process, is that correct?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, no, there isn't.
Thank you.
Representative Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for the record, I agree with Representative Kirby. I think the first thing we should do is kill all the lawyers. So. Shakespeare, by the way. The counselor, I'm sorry, what was your last name again?
Perales.
Perales?
Mhm.
You mentioned that we had the 49th TTD reimbursement rate, I think.
Maximum rate, yes, sir.
What, as far as states, where do we rank in cost of living? Do you know?
No, I haven't really gotten into that. Like I said, I mean, I suspect, and this is just general knowledge, we're probably going to be more in the middle on that. But I really don't want to tell you something that I
Sure.
don't know about.
See, and I know that Mr. Bowen said he's going, I believe he's asked to respond, and he'll probably give us a perspective. But what split would you like on the committees?
What split? I would like a little more even split between you know, those who represent the employer insurance industry and those who represent on the claimant side. I like to see also medical doctors increase their participation there because they're a very important stakeholder in this system if they're delivering the care.
If there's, and you may not know this either, but I'm always curious, and I've heard this number before, I just can't remember what it is. If there's 100 comp injuries in Georgia, how many of those comp injuries actually involve attorneys? Do you know?
Based on the last study that I saw, WCRI, the Workers' Compensation Research Institute, which is an insurance industry, you know, institute, there were about 38% of claimants had a lawyer, and I believe 43 or 41% had defense lawyers. So there were more defense lawyers in files than claimants' lawyers.
So hovers sound kind of like it hovers around a third, close to a third, maybe a little more.
Right. Now, you'd be interested to know that if you look at the numbers back in 2000, I believe those figures were more like in the low 20s, 20%. And quite frankly, to address your question about killing all the lawyers, you know, that's a fair comment in workers' comp because workers' compensation is a self-executing system. There's no need for lawyers. The reason we have lawyers is because employees are not getting the benefits that they're supposed to get. And with the increase in the delay of medical care over the last few years, we've seen obviously more seek the help of lawyers, and we're seeing the increase in the number of lawyers in the system. You know, if I could get us to 0 lawyers in the system, I'd say you're doing a beautiful job. You know, and let's get there.
I was kidding just a little bit when I said
No,
kill all
sir.
the
I mean,
lawyers.
it's a good opportunity for me to explain this point that you know I just made to you.
Occasionally, one of my clients will accuse me of being a lawyer, but not all the time. So, the last time, the last thing, Mr. Chairman, if I may, and I was just curious. I mean, if and I may ask you for the second most important thing you would want us to change too, but If you right now could ask us to change one thing with the comp system through legislation, what would it be?
Legislation, get rid of the 400-week MAC cap completely, totally.
What would be the second thing?
Second thing, probably indexing.
You said the 400, I'm sorry, the first thing, 400-week med cap?
Yes, yes, sir. 400-week MAC cap. Medical. In other words, when the worker wakes up on week number
Right.
401, he's in pain.
Unless it's a catastrophic injury.
Unless it's catastrophic. You're
So,
correct.
and what about number two? What would be the second thing?
Probably, I say indexing.
So that the rates would raise automatically.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't have to try to cajole an increase in rates.
Thank you. I appreciate you coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That's why I'm glad Mr. Fleming's on this committee. He's always got great questions. Okay, there are no other questions. John Poole, did you want to talk before? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is John Poole. I represent the Georgia Workers' Compensation Association. It's an association of employers, mostly self-insured employers, and includes some of Georgia's biggest employers. A number of our members serve on various committees of the Advisory Council, and I serve, excuse me, on the Legislative Committee. We put a good bit of value on the Advisory Council. We do that even though we rarely get very much direct in the way of legislative items. Mr. Kirby, we have asked for subrogation for many years in the Advisory Council, along with a number of other issues. We don't come down here and ask you for them because we try to do it within that process. We have not, I don't believe, come down here and asked for any legislation other than the Advisory Council bill since 1992. And that's because if we're going to be in this advisory process, we're going to stick to it. It's a stakeholder process, and that's what gives it value. And it's important to note, too, it's a consensus process. And that's why the numbers don't really matter much. If you've got one objection on the legislative committee, you're probably not going to get what you're asking for. And that's why we don't have subrogation in Georgia, or a workable subrogation. We recognize fully that you guys are the final arbiters. My understanding is that the regulations that come out of the state board are sent to the two committees in the legislature. And of course, you see the legislation that comes from the Advisory Council, and it is purely advisory. It's the chairman's bill when it comes. But usually they pay a lot of attention because it's a stakeholder process. It's the people that are in the system that are doing it. We think that's what gives it value, and we think that if you go to something like the Administrative Procedures Act, we wind up with a process that doesn't really work anymore. And the other thing is, if all the players aren't involved, if all the players aren't sticking to that system, it's ultimately going to fail. And that's why we don't come down separately and ask for another bill. We'll all wind up like Louisiana, where they have dozens of work comp bills every year. We don't need that. We need to have a good, stable system. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you. Is there any questions, Mr. Poole? Representative Park?
Mr.
Wait,
Poole.
hold on, Mr. Poole.
Thank you, Mr. Poole. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question, not at all. So I think it's clear that the Advisory Council is great, especially as it involves all the stakeholders, but do you think that there are maybe ways to improve the process in which perhaps there could be more collaboration, or whether it wouldn't necessarily depend wholly on one chairman inviting a collaborative process?
You know, I can only speak for the Legislative Committee. I don't really sit in the others. We are balanced in there. There's a very, I think, a almost exact balance. I haven't counted, but I think it's nearly exact between employer interests, employee interests. There's insurance. There's labor is represented. Our collaboration involves really the kind of heated discussions that used to go on in these legislative bodies. So what happens is the kind of bloodbath situations we had in 1992 are avoided here because we have them elsewhere. And we come in with a bill that everybody has agreed on. Doesn't mean we like all of it. Doesn't mean we have everything we want. As Mr. Kirby said, there's nothing in this coming bill really for employers, but we needed to increase that benefit. We should have done it 2 years ago. We should do it pretty regularly, but it ought to be done by this body and not be an entitlement that's automatic. It ought to be done in conjunction with the health of the system. And so I feel like within our committee we have a lot of collaboration, a lot of give and take, and sometimes it's a little contentious, but we get along. We have respect for each other in there because we're sticking to the system.
Thank you, Mr. Poole.
Anything else?
Thank you. No, having sat through a couple of judiciary committee hearings, I'm glad y'all do those bloodbaths apart from here also. All right, Roy, I'm gonna let you respond, and then you got one more.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I just want to touch on a couple of points of rebuttal. On the indexing, I mean, we don't index unemployment insurance benefits. We don't index employee salaries or pension benefits or cost of living. We don't index workers' comp benefits. What we do strive to do is keep that maximum weekly benefit at about 2/3 of the average weekly wage. And when that's not happened, I can tell you it was not because the employers didn't want it to happen. In terms of the lowest weekly benefit, you got to look at more than the weekly benefit. It's a lot easier to get benefits here in Georgia than it is in other states. If you take a look at data that would indicate employer cost or cost per covered worker or cost per payroll, we're squarely in the middle. We're not at the low end. We've got a very generous system here in Georgia. In terms of the composition of the advisory council, I do take exception to my good friend, Mr. Perales, and we do go back a number of years. I think take a look at the legislative committee. I mean, there are an equal number of defense and claimant lawyers. And I do take exception to the fact that a medical professional is not representing the interest of the injured worker. I mean, I think that's ridiculous to cast him or to cast a medical provider as not looking out for the interest of a medical worker or an injured worker. You mentioned Representative the Public Education Committee. I mean, the Public Education Committee essentially is designed to enlighten the providers and the employers about what's going on in the area of workers' comp so they can be better stewards of the system and better administer the system. Really, it's not designed to interact with employees. There's employee representation on the committee. But I mean, this is really designed, these conferences are for employers and governments and the sort. So I think that's a way to look at that. You know, the medical committee obviously has more medical folks than others. I mean, Mr. Herman and I were talking, it would be nice to have more medical professionals on the council. But frankly, I mean, there are literally thousands of hours, volunteer hours, devoted to this council. I am thankful for the sacrifice that the medical folks are making that are serving. We simply can't get many more medical folks on the committee. Ms. Fleming, you'd asked about the indexing. I hope I responded to that. Again, we don't index. That'd be the next thing, unemployment, and the nose is under the runaway horse there. Anyway, the other one, the 400-week cap on medical, that was agreed to by the advisory council. There were some on the advisory council that today don't agree with it. Might not have agreed with it at the time. But at the time, that was agreed to by the claimants bar, defense bar, and every other stakeholder group on the council. And I will tell you that the notion or the suggestion that we're coming, the recommendation to deal with an exception for the 400-week cap really came out of the employer side, because we thought that might have been a little stringent. So with that,
Okay, you've got a question, Representative Fleming?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an oversimplification to say two sides to this, because it's a complicated situation with all the
Correct.
different entities that are represented. But to the extent to try to ask a question, I'm going to say there's two sides: the claimant side and the employer side. This loose arrangement, I'll call it for lack of better terms, or maybe it's by board order, I don't know, that we have the advisory panels that debate and bring to us a consensus package, so to speak. I think it's been around before I was here, and I learned of it when I came to the legislature about 18 years ago, or 16 years ago. But my question is this: as I understood the quote unquote, I don't know if you want to call it a gentleman's agreement or what, neither side comes to us and asks us to do something unless the panels suggest it. Is that a fair, accurate representation?
I would say that's a gentleman's agreement. It sure is, and I would say that the claimants bar has been in lockstep with that.
They've never kind of violated that agreement, unless it comes.
I would say that there might have been a faction of that group that did, but I mean, by and large, that's
so by
how
that
we
standard,
work.
the claimants bar has been good actors. You could say.
I'm sorry?
By that standard, the claimants bar have been good actors in this.
Yes.
Okay.
And as Mr. Herman said, I mean, he has a lot of respect for and values the advisory council, and I appreciate his statement to that effect.
On the issue of that was brought up about if you cause too many waves, you get thanked for your service, and you're not kept on the panel. You want to comment on that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. As I said, we draw upon all these stakeholder groups for the expertise and their experience that they can bring and the perspective that they can bring. We sit around a table. This is not a platform. We don't regard the advisory council as a platform from which you advocate for a special interest. So if you find yourself in that role, you're marginalized, for one, and you're not serving the interest of the council, and you're not really bringing the perspective, a good shared perspective. So there are cases like that where people have not been asked to continue. But generally speaking, I would say that they've been.
We should have a rule like that in the legislature.
Yeah. But generally speaking, they would have been replaced by someone from that same stakeholder group.
So, and I'm reminded, this is my last question, Mr. Chairman, I'm reminded of a process that I have seen with my hospital authority. The Board of Commissioners in most counties fund, to some extent, the local hospital or have a role in the hospital authority. They don't get to pick the authority board members, but they do get to have a say-so in the process. And sometimes they give they nominate half a dozen people, and the hospital board gets to pick 2 or 3 of them or something like that. What I was getting to is there any way to consider allowing the claimants bar to have a little more voice in their representation on the panels, by somehow not getting to say that it's going to be John Smith and nobody else, but somehow have some input into that. Now I'm saying that they don't informally, but I'm trying to address this accusation of if you don't play along, you get asked to leave. And I'm not saying it's correct.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying that I've seen situations where, it's not totally analogous, but if you want to be on the federal bench, only the president can nominate you, but only the Senate can approve you.
Yeah.
So they have to work together to pick the person, so to speak. I would ask you just to think about that.
I will. I mean, I think the notion I wanted to dissuade you of is that this is that this happens all the time.
Right.
I mean, in the time that I've been on the council, there might have been a handful, 5.
Right.
I mean, and that's over a long
Sure.
period of time.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a question from Sam, Representative Park.
Mr. Bowen, thank
Yes,
you for
sir.
being here again. So similar to the question I asked Mr. Poole earlier, do you think that there are, as the chairman of the current advisory council, do you think that there are structural reforms that could be put into place that could perhaps address some of the concerns that have been raised, which is why I think there was this effort to, place the advisory council under APA or eliminate it entirely. So going forward, especially, given, tenure and things of that nature, if you may no longer be there to foster that kind of collaborative process, are there structural reforms that you would be interested in seeing, and where do you think such changes could possibly be made, either internally from the compensation board itself, or do you think a legislative fix may be helpful in that?
Yeah.
In that
Well, I mean,
capacity?
I think as Mr. Poole and others have said, at the end of the day, you all have the wherewithal to either vote up or down a piece of legislation that comes from the advisory council that really has come from the chairman and through the governor's office. So at the end of the day, that's your prerogative. I think the system works fairly well. In fact, it works very well. People are trying to emulate it around the country, as Mr. Kirby said. And the companies that I represent have locations throughout the country. And I will tell you, there's not one of them that thinks that Georgia's not the very best workers' comp system. So I don't think the wheel's broke. I mean, are there anecdotal things that need to be addressed from time to time? Sure. And I think as Mr. Gannon said, when something does come up that just didn't work the way we envisioned, we work on it.
Thank you,
really
Mr.
do.
Bowen.
Mr. Chairman, again, thanks so much
Okay.
for the opportunity.
Judge Chastain wanted to make a quick comment, then we've got one final.
I'll be brief. I just want to say it. Thank you. It's about the makeup of the advisory committee. It's my understanding, and I want to look back here at my our fellow judges, that number one, the committees have been trying to operate by consensus, not by majority vote or 2/3. Which helps the dynamic. You may not have 50%, let's say, employee representatives. That could be plaintiffs' bar, advocates. That's not only any of them, but okay. Yeah. Okay, but no, I'm saying, like, if you had a straight majority vote, the numbers may be more. Maybe you might need to have more 50%. But when you operate by consensus, we try to have a significant amount. I know the chairman's try to have a significant amount of representation from the plaintiff's bar. And it just so it happens that there's also the insurance side, there's doctors, there's all these other niches in the system that one could say is not necessarily like for the employee, and you could put them in a bucket with the employer, but if you just go 50-50 or something like that, one side or the other, you're going to have, maybe 10 plaintiffs' lawyers and then one each from these different sides. Now, that may be fine, or and I'm not casting any aspersions, but we've tried to operate on consensus. And I can tell you that Mr. Herman and Mr. Clark, they're not shy, and they make their points known. And they are heard. So I just wanted to make that point in reference to perhaps some of the makeup.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, don't leave, because Judge, you have a question from Representative Fleming.
Oh, yes.
Your Honor.
Mr. Representative?
I'm just thinking through in my head how all this works, and thinking back to basic structure of the governmental process here. So the Workers' Compensation Board is a part of the executive branch of government. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so the other administrative type law judges that we have, and I use that term, I don't know if that is that an appropriate
That-
term to apply?
That is, exactly.
So the other type, like, I'm thinking of Judge Larry O'Neill. He's a member of the judicial branch, or is he a member of the?
I think he's the executive
That's the tax
branch.
court I'm talking
Right,
about.
correct.
Yeah. He's a member of the executive branch also. So there's all kind of administrative law judges. I know if you have a challenge on residency for some things with when I run for office, then that's an administrative law judge too, right?
Correct.
So what the board cannot do in setting rules is you cannot go beyond the scope of authority given to you by the code. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's correct.
And if you went beyond, if someone believes that a rule goes beyond the scope of the law that we pass, you can challenge that as being what? I guess it wouldn't be unconstitutional, but it would be rule-making authority and violates that contradicts the statute, I guess.
I mean, theoretically, we would exceed our statutory authority, delegated authority.
And that can
from
be challenged.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And I think the discussion that I've heard regarding this is our oversight. And obviously, as has been mentioned, we can always pass a statute that changes something that you do or you don't do. We do have ultimate control if we can get the Senate and the governor to agree with that. But I know that the Administrative Procedures Act is used in some other executive branch agencies, but not the workers' comp, because it's a different animal a little bit, right?
That's correct.
And so would you have you ever heard anybody pontificate on any kind of oversight beyond which we obviously have to pass a statute that would be something that would be workable? Is that a word? And I'm asking you a question you may not have thought through, and you don't have to answer it right now. You could come think about it a while and get back with me later. I was just
No, and I think that's a fair question. I think part of what I want to do today and with this committee going forward is sort of understand some of the areas maybe where we could learn how to communicate or what the issues are and sort of liaison back and forth and how that would work. So I think that's an excellent question.
you may want to educate yourself on the legislative process and how it works in case you're not up on it.
The speaker is the source from which all good things flow. That is my legislative.
I think you understand.
Yes.
Okay, Representative McLean.
Thank you, Judge.
Sir,
I think
absolutely.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we were talking about the makeup and things of that nature, I decided I like just reading and looking at this document. But of the 6 committees, either they're defense lawyers or they're the insurance companies. I mean, I don't see any claimant with any claimant lawyer with any, I guess, kind of like this board, but I don't see that. And it's kind of like, I believe that in this you do have the 3. You have the employers, you have the insurance, and you have the workers, which are the claimants. I just have concern when I look at this.
Yes, sir. And I just got this like y'all did when we came in. I'm happy to sit down and look at it and talk it through.
Yeah.
And see if we can figure out if we're both agreeing that which bucket they go in and see if we can work through it. So I appreciate you pointing that out.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to end with the fellow who started all this, Senator Blake Tillery.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate y'all allowing me to show up. It's been fun sitting in the back of the room this little bit of time. In one way, I feel like the little senator who wrote the amendment that caused this big war. So it's kind of fun to be here. And let me assure you this, Mr. Perales, the one thing that they hate more than lawyers is the guys wearing these blue badges. So you're clear for the evening after this. Thank you for letting me be here. Thank you for letting me present to you for just 1 minute about kind of what was going on. The funny thing, I've heard a lot of people talk about claimants. I've heard a lot of people talk about employers. But this bill wasn't about that at all. It was clearly about, this amendment was about legislative oversight. And I don't know how that's getting missed in all this. Let me tell you how it works now. And the way I know how it works now is because I had a little bill that came up my first year in the Senate, And I was asked, well, you might want to run that through advisory, and that was fine with me. I would run it through advisory again now. But my understanding was if it's going to be substantive, if it's going to deal with workers' comp, it needs to go through advisory. Okay, so let's build a circle here. We can do it a barn with 2 open gates. You got doors on one side and doors on the other. The legislation's flowing through. If you're wanting to get into the barn, you got to go through advisory. That's fine. I can live with that. But then when we're going out the other side, I realized that we have another set of doors. And that other set of doors, well, that's the rulemaking authority of the agency, right? And if you're wanting to have anything to do with that set of doors, well, that's where 6 pages of the Administrative Procedures Act come in. And we have that power as the legislature. We can set aside rulemaking rules made by agencies because of 6 pages of the Administrative Procedures Act that say if an administrative agency passes a bill or passes a rule that is substantive, and the legislature thinks it goes too far, that is ultra virtes, right? Ultra virtes, is that how we say it? Virus, sorry. If it goes too far, you do have a private right as a citizen. You can file a court case and you can go through 6 months of discovery and do everything you want to do there. Or as a legislature, the 2 committees that have oversight, the one in the Senate and the one in the House, can say, hey, we're going to put the pause on that for a while. And we're just going to pause it now. And when we come back into General Assembly session, we can set that aside. Now, y'all, I used to be able to run you through every single thing that those 6 pages said. Because for about 30 days, I had to know. I got a ton of phone calls. I'm sure you did too. And I had to walk everyone from the governor's office to the Senate office to folks in the House through what that did and why. Now, it's about 6 months past, and we had a little hurricane that damaged my area, and that is not priority number 1 for me anymore. But if you want me to learn it again, I certainly will. Let me tell you what those 6 pages of the Administrative Procedures Act did. And just so you know, those 6 pages, there are 115 pages of the Administrative Procedures Act. This amendment did not bind anybody to the Administrative Procedures Act. It bound them to 6 pages of the Administrative Procedures Act that dealt solely with setting aside rules. That little amendment passed the Senate 55-1. It passed your body without a no vote at all. Now, some people will stand up here and say, well, that's because it was done in the dead of night and secret, et cetera. You can't pass anything through this body with 1 no vote. There's just too many voices. So I put to you that there was something in it. And it was something that mattered to the 236 of us who get to wear one of these badges. And what mattered to us is this. While I agree completely with the advisory committee and think that we need it, it is strong and it's something that we need, we represent 10.5 million Georgians. And in the end, we've got to make that call. And if the answer to how we set aside an advisory rule, and it's not really an advisory council rule, it has to be done by the board, so there's a little step after that. If the answer is we then go back around to the front doors of that barn again and have to go through the advisory committee to set aside that rule, that's a circle that doesn't work. There's a process for us 236, and that's why I thought those 6 pages matter. Again, that's not number 1 issue to me anymore. I still think those 6 pages matter, and they matter more for just comp. They matter in everything that we do down here at the General Assembly. There are a couple of other agencies that are exempt. One of them's Department of Corrections. I think that's understandable why. And Regents, which Regents is constitutionally completely different to begin with. Let me give you examples of other agencies that are bound by those 6 pages, not just those 6, the other 115. Department of Natural Resources, EPD, Department of Revenue. In fact, in my tenure, although I know it's been brief, the only time I've ever seen an agency rule set aside was when the Department of Revenue said, hey, if you're going to file a deed at the courthouse, you have to get approval from us first. And attorneys went, whoa. That doesn't work. And both the Ways and Means, I believe, in the House, and then Banks and Banking in the Senate got together and said, hey, we're going to set that aside at least to the next legislative session. And they stopped it. I don't think these guys would do anything that crazy. But these guys won't always be here. And one day if somebody does do that, what would be the process for us to set it aside then? And the answer is, well, we don't know. Because we'd come back in the General Assembly and we propose a bill, and it would go to the advisory committee. And if the advisory committee didn't pass it through, then the advisory committee is going to be against it. So then do we not get to bring that general legislation? I pose that to you to ask you just to think about that. This is not something we're going to address in special session. It's very clear we won't. It's not on the call. It's not on the call because it doesn't need to be. What needs to be on the call is what's going on in Southwest Georgia. I'm so thankful to the chairman for allowing this meeting to happen today. Thank you for allowing the room to be cleared and us to air these issues. I'm so thankful for the speakers who came. Y'all mean a lot to me. I used to work and get coffee for Judge Amahara. So, Judge, hey, I grew up. So, but thank you so very much again. I appreciate y'all allowing me to be here and to answer your questions.
Don't leave. You have a question from the Honorable Fleming.
Thank you, Senator. I was thinking, I was going to ask the question, and you answered it in part, and that is, what other agencies are exempt from the Administrative Procedures Act? And I think you said corrections and
Corrections and
Regents is
Regents.
really not exempt. They're just constitutional, right? I mean,
Well, they actually in the code, they're one of the ones that are exempt. And again, I apologize. I probably could have quoted this to you 6 months
Yeah.
ago, but I remember those two off the top of my head.
yeah, and I was thinking through with you, and you may have run into this as you dealt with this. I mean, you obviously believe that the Workers' Compensation Board should be subject to the Administrative Procedures Act.
When you start going and making the whole 115 pages doesn't make sense.
I'm
because
sorry,
there are things that apply there.
the oversight portion with
Right.
us being able to set aside a
And if I
rule.
could have written an amendment on the floor, handwritten it quick enough to write out what it would do and leave the APA completely out of it, I would have done that. But
Mhm.
when you're dealing with, you got other bills that are being dealt with as well. I mean, kind of had to write quick.
I think I know that. I'm assuming I know the answer to your question that I'm about to ask, but I just wanted to lay it out there. I mean, why is there nothing distinct about the comp board that is distinct about some of these other agencies that are exempt that we should not consider bringing them under this? Is there? I'm trying to understand the pros and cons
Right.
of the issue, and
I
didn't
think
know.
there are some things that are distinct, which is why when I wrote the amendment, I didn't go to the title. It's the Administrative Procedures Act. What is it? 34. Let's see here. I didn't go grab 5013.4 and said the whole thing applies.
Right.
So we tried to take.
Well, you just did the 6 pages, which is the oversight provision for the committee,
Yes,
and
sir.
how we overturn stuff. But
Yes,
there's
sir.
nothing about the comp board in your mind, and you're arguing against yourself if you answer my question. But you're the last person to testify.
I don't want
so-
to leave myself some areas to dance too. Stand
Yeah.
in front of the house.
Absolutely. Well, that's the question I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask each side, what makes you different that it shouldn't apply to you?
Yeah, and I think there are some things that are different about the APA. You're a
Mhm.
quasi-judicial executive agency. You are somewhat different. But as far as rulemaking goes, I would argue that let's see, here is it 5013.4E. And again, if I'm quoting that wrong, please don't hold me to it. That there's nothing that should be different. When you're making rules, listen, the legislature gets to have oversight over executive rules.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Don't. Representative Park.
Thank you, Senator Tillery. I understand where you're coming from. Do you think that imposing additional legislative oversight would in any ways undermine the work that the advisory council does in some capacity?
No, thank you for your question, and it also reminded me of something you asked earlier that I got to sit in and hear about. I don't, and here's why. Although I've only been here 2 years, I've only seen it happen once. But when I ask senior members, they don't remember it happening at all. And so I tell you, it's a very rare fact when it happens. But that if you don't have a sword to be wielded, it's hard for you to use it also as a shield. So, and you asked a question earlier about 1992 and the advisory committee then. I think that's actually in code. If you go back and look, it was 3 members from the Senate to be appointed by the Lieutenant Governor, 3 members from the House to be appointed by the Speaker, and 3 members from the Governor. And you asked about that question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, congratulations. I've done the thing that I despise the most around here, and that's in the committee meeting to get you out just in time for 5 o'clock traffic. But I did try to meet this at 1, so y'all are adjourned. Thank you so much.